Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, but before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers and every single click counts. And today's deck is going to be a Precon upgrade of the Endless Punishment Precon. And the commander for that Precon is Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls. For 2 colorless, 1 black and 1 red, it's a legendary creature Elder Demon 4/4 with flying, ward, pay 2 life, and whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a +1/+1 counter on Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, and draw a card. So the wording of this is not as great as it could be. It's been designed in a very safe way because it only triggers once during the opponent's own turn, which means you can only ever get 1 counter on it per turn, which I suppose is good because otherwise there were some cards that could definitely make this very, very broken. That being said, it's still a really fun build around that can draw you a ton of cards, 3 per turn cycle to be exact, and grow itself fairly big fairly quickly, so it's definitely a good threat. And the ward pay life ability actually works very nicely too, because if they want to remove it and they're doing it during their turn, they're going to trigger this, which is going to mean that you're going to end up drawing a card, which is very, very nice. Now, I've always loved Punisher decks, I got to admit. I used to have a very strong Kevek Punisher deck, and the amount of support that the archetype has got out of this set is just insane. This looks really good out of the box, but I do think there's a couple of changes we can make. So without further ado, we're going to jump in first to the cards we've cut. And we're starting off with Theater of Horrors. Yes, we can trigger our commander with this, but it costs a whopping 4 mana to do so, and I just don't feel like the exile ability is that good in general. I'm really not a huge fan of this card overall, although it can be good in certain situations. Seance Board doesn't really fit at all with what the deck is trying to do. It's got a morbid trigger, but we're not necessarily causing creatures to die every turn, and then we can only use the mana for instant sorceries, demons, or spirits. I really don't know what this does with the rest of the deck. I can also kind of see why Blood Pact is in the deck. It can be used to trigger our commander by making our opponents draw, but that's just not that great, and if you're using it to draw yourself, 3 mana for 2 cards is really not very good. Not to mention the fact that we should be drawing a bunch of cards with our commander anyway, so we don't really need that much card draw in the deck. We've cut 3 cards that are to do with aristocrats, such as Falcon Wrath Noble, Blood Artist, and Bastion of Remembrance. While these are decent cards, there's no guarantee that they're going to trigger during your opponent's own turn, and they're really not synergizing that much with the rest of the deck, seeing as we don't have that many sacrifice outlets, so I think it's pretty safe to cut them. We've removed a total of 3 lands from the deck as well. Canyon Slough has been removed because we're making face for a modal double-faced land, and we've also removed 1 mountain and 1 swamp because I feel like 38 lands are just too much for a deck like this. Our curve is really low, we've got a lot of card draw, and our commander's fairly cheap, so we really don't need to be running that many lands. Enchanter's Bane was a fairly easy cut because it doesn't really trigger during our opponent's turn at all, which means it doesn't work with our commander in the slightest. It's also a Punisher card that gives them a lot of agency over what they want to do. I do like that it is kind of like red hating on enchantments, but it's really too conditional for me for it to work. Vile Smasher the Fierce has also been cut for similar reasons. It's not going to be triggering during your opponent's turn, which is what the deck wants to be doing. While it is a really strong card, it can dish out a lot of damage. I feel like it doesn't mesh too well with our commander, so we're cutting it. Tectonic Giant is similarly going to deal damage, but only during our turn, which doesn't trigger our commander. It can give us a little bit of card advantage, and it's a decent card to cut, but we're making space for better stuff, so it had to go. Mayhem Devil was another card we cut from the deck, and we cut it for similar reasons that we cut Bastion of Remembrance and Blood Artist and cards like that. It just doesn't really synergize with our deck that much. We are not an Aristocrats deck, and while it is a decent card that's going to deal damage here and there, it might not do it in a way that's going to trigger our commander. Sign in Blood was cut because, again, we have enough card draw, and the option to make our opponents lose 2 life to trigger our commander just isn't that appealing. Osh Mentor was one of the last cuts. I do think it is a solid card, and it probably has a place in the deck if we didn't have to make this many cuts, but there's just better things we can be including, and it's not really guaranteed that this is going to trigger that much. Morbid Opportunist was cut because we don't need that much card draw, as we've mentioned before, and we're also not going to be able to trigger it as consistently as I would like. That being said, it's still an excellent card, and if you don't want to include any of the cards I added, this would be one of the first cards I would keep. And finally, Light Up the Stage is conditional card draw that is very easy to trigger during our turn, but we just don't need that many of this kind of effect. Not to mention that we sometimes might not want to use the cards we've hit with this, which makes it very mid. Now moving on to the cards we've added, and there's some very spicy ones here. We're starting off with Chandra Awakened Inferno. This is an awesome card in the deck because it immediately gives you an emblem that is guaranteed to trigger your commander for the rest of the game. This is an absolute all-star. Once you get it out, you're basically always going to have your commander drawing you cards turn after turn after turn, turn. It does paint a big threat on your commander, but it is so sweet in the deck. Obnixilis the Hate Twister is one of many cards that are going to trigger when our opponents draw. These are great in the deck because it means they're going to trigger our commander at the start of each of our opponent's turn, which is exactly what we want. Whip of Erebos is excellent in this deck. We have a lot of things that deal damage, and a lot of them comes from creatures, so they are all going to be gaining us life whenever they trigger. Blood-Soaked Insight is really solid in this deck. We've got a lot of ways to make our opponents lose life, which means that this can come down for very cheap and give us some nice card advantage by stealing stuff from our opponent's deck. Not only that, it's just a really good model double-faced land. Bolt Bend is a card that I love to add to all of my Rakdos decks, particularly ones where our commander has power 4 or more, which this one is. It just gives a great way to protect our commander very cheaply. The same applies for the new Untimely Malfunction, which is one of the best uncommons from Duskmourn. This is incredibly solid and gives us 3 really good options in one card. Kibble's Trickery is yet more protection from our commander. It's another card I love to include in decks that don't run blue, just as a way to really surprise your opponents by countering a clutch spell. Withering Torment is yet another new addition from Duskmourn. This is essential in any Rakdos deck as a way to interact with enchantments. Sazan, Perverter of Truth is really solid and it's dropped so much in price. It's incredibly affordable right now. It works really nicely in this deck. Yes, it is going to give our opponents cards, but it's also going to trigger a lot of our effects, including our commander. Eidolon of the Great Revel is a personal favorite of mine from back in the day. It can also damage you, but if you give it lifelink, which we have a bunch of ways to do in this deck, this is going to gain you so much life, and it makes your opponent's life so much harder by heavily restricting the kind of spells that they can cast if they want to not trigger your commander. Cemetery Gatekeeper can be really brutal against the right deck. If you know what your opponents are playing, this can be very powerful. Say you exile a creature in a pod which is very creature heavy, now every time they're playing those creatures, they're going to take a ton of damage, which is also of course going to be triggering your commander. This is just really good in the deck. Obnixilis Captive Kingpin is very solid with our commander and with the rest of our deck. We've got a lot of effects to trigger by dealing just 1 life to our opponents, so this is just going to work perfectly with all those effects. Solfim Mayhem Dominus is amazing in this deck. It is a little bit pricey, but I think it's worth it for the amount of damage that this is going to output. A vast majority of the damage in this deck is non-combat based, which means that this is going to deal so much damage. Not only that, but since we're drawing a bunch of cards with our commander, it's not even that difficult to pitch 2 cards to this to make it indestructible. Rug of Smothering is a really annoying card from Baldur's Gate. It can really put the brakes on your opponents and make it very difficult for them to get their game going. Particularly if they're the kind of deck that's going to be playing multiple cards per turn, this can really ramp up the damage, and of course it's going to trigger our commander very nicely. Underworld Dreams is a card that I'm surprised wasn't in the deck to start off with, but yeah, it works really well with what our deck is doing by triggering on each opponent's turn. Rolling Vortex is a personal favorite of mine because you can turn off life gain, but you don't have to do it all the time. You can gain life during your turn, and then you can turn it off during your opponent's turn, which is really nice. It also randomly hates on Cascade decks or decks that really cheat on mana. I really like that as well. And then as an extra bonus, it just deals damage to your opponents every single turn, which means you're going to be drawing a ton of cards with your commander. Finally, we have Razorkin Needlehead, which is another redundant way to make sure your opponents are taking damage during the turn, and it just guarantees that your commander is going to draw 3 cards per turn cycle. Really solid in this deck. It is currently a bit expensive, but I do think it'll drop as more packs of Duskmourn are open. So there you have it. That has been my Endless Punishment Precon deck upgrade. What do you think about this one? Are there any cards you think I should have added? Any things you think I shouldn't have included? Let me know in the comment section below. I always make sure to read all of your comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.